Movies have been feeding us nonsense about medieval sieges for years. What you've seen on screen isn't just wrong, it's way off. The real story is darker, stranger, and nothing like the action packed fantasy we're used to. Here are 7 major things the movies got completely wrong. Hollywood treats siege towers like medieval fast food, quick, cheap, and available everywhere. Every castle attack features these massive wooden structures rolling toward walls while heroes prepare for dramatic battles. But building a real siege tower was more challenging than constructing a cathedral. These weren't simple wooden boxes with wheels attached. A proper siege tower required master carpenters, dozens of skilled workers, and enormous amounts of quality timber. Each tower was basically a wooden apartment building that had to commute to work. Finding enough suitable wood created massive logistical headaches. Armies needed fresh, strong timber from healthy forests near their target. Many castles were deliberately built where large forests were scarce. Trying to build wooden towers in a treeless landscape was about as practical as making snowballs in summer. The financial cost was staggering. A single tower consumed resources equivalent to equipping hundreds of soldiers with weapons and armor. Medieval kingdoms operated on limited budgets, making siege towers the equivalent of buying sports cars when you needed grocery money. Weather presented constant construction challenges. Rain turned building sites into muddy disasters and made timber heavy and difficult to handle. Strong winds could topple partially completed towers or make finished ones impossible to move safely. Medieval weather forecasts consisted of looking up and hoping for the best. Fire represented the ultimate nightmare for siege tower builders. Defenders loved shooting flaming arrows at these wooden targets because they burned spectacularly well. A burning siege tower was essentially a very costly bonfire that nobody wanted to attend. Most siege towers never reached their intended targets. Defenders had plenty of warning while these slow-moving structures approached. Watching a siege tower approach was like watching a very expensive, very flammable parade that nobody invited. Castle locations made siege towers impractical in most situations. Fortifications were built on hills, rocky ground, and uneven terrain specifically designed to complicate attacks. Moving a 5-story wooden building uphill while under enemy fire was exactly as difficult as it sounds. The assembly required teams of specialists who understood complex construction without modern tools or safety equipment. One major mistake could collapse the entire project and kill multiple workers. Medieval construction standards were basically, hope nobody dies while building this thing. Many commanders viewed siege towers as expensive gambles with poor odds. Why risk enormous resources on wooden contraptions when other tactics often worked better? Smart military leaders preferred strategies with higher success rates and lower costs. Of course, when Hollywood can't use massive wooden towers, they always fall back on their other favorite siege spectacle. Movies portray medieval siege weapons as simple boulder launchers. Load rock, aim at wall, fire, repeat until victory. Real medieval siege engines were far more sophisticated and terrifying than basic stone-throwing devices. The terminology confusion begins with calling everything a catapult. Medieval armies used trebuchets powered by counterweights, mangonels that twisted ropes for energy, and ballistas that functioned like oversized crossbows. Lumping them together was like calling every musical instrument a guitar. Technically, some were, but you missed drums, pianos, and everything else that made noise. Ammunition selection revealed medieval creativity at its finest. Plain rocks were considered boring options. Armies preferred psychological warfare through absolutely disgusting projectiles. Dead animals, rotting corpses, and diseased body parts made excellent ammunition because they spread terror, illness, and revolting smells inside enemy fortifications. Clay pots filled with burning substances created early incendiary weapons. These containers could start fires inside wooden structures or produce thick smoke that made wall defense nearly impossible. The goal wasn't always destroying walls. Sometimes it was making life inside castles smell like a garbage dump on fire. Trebuchets could launch objects weighing over 200 pounds across distances exceeding 300 yards. That meant hurling something the size of a washing machine farther than 3 football fields. But accuracy was an entirely different challenge. Medieval siege weapon crews had roughly the same precision as people trying to thread needles while riding galloping horses. Wind, weather, mechanical problems, and human error meant most shots missed their targets completely. A few months ago, I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancée got me one, and I have to say, I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly, I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60, and it's clear. This one is the best bang for your buck, with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you are on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Operating a trebuchet was like playing darts blindfolded while someone spun you around and pushed you. Weather conditions created constant operational difficulties. Rain made rope components stretch and wooden parts swell, altering machine performance unpredictably. Cold temperatures made materials brittle and prone to sudden failure. Medieval siege engines were basically fair-weather friends who disappeared when things got tough. Operating these weapons required teams of trained specialists. Trebuchet crews needed engineers who understood physics, carpenters capable of field repairs, and workers who could handle dangerous machinery without getting flattened. Setup and calibration demanded considerable time before machines could shoot effectively. Enemy defensive fire frequently destroyed siege weapons before they accomplished anything meaningful. Castle defenders had their own ranged weapons and weren't shy about using them aggressively. Ammunition logistics presented serious challenges for besieging forces. Random stones wouldn't work properly. Siege engines needed correctly sized and shaped projectiles for optimal performance. But even the most impressive war machines couldn't create the non-stop action that movies demand from medieval warfare. Medieval films transform every siege into endless action sequences packed with heroic charges, dramatic combat, and constant excitement. Real medieval sieges resembled extremely boring camping expeditions, where people occasionally tried to kill each other. The typical siege involved one army sitting outside castle walls while defenders waited inside. No continuous battles, no daily heroic speeches, no inspiring musical soundtracks. The most thrilling moments probably involved debates about whose turn it was to clean the latrines. The siege of Kenilworth in 1266 lasted over 6 months with minimal actual fighting. Attackers established camps, blocked supply routes, and waited for hunger to force surrender. Both sides occasionally exchanged arrows or insults, but mostly they watched each other like bored neighbors across a very hostile fence. Starvation served as the primary weapon in most siege situations. Castles maintained food stores for weeks or months, but supplies eventually dwindled. Once hunger became severe, people faced simple choices: surrender or starve. Medieval sieges were basically very expensive dieting programs that nobody wanted to join. Disease claimed more lives during sieges than enemy weapons combined. Large populations living in cramped conditions without proper sanitation created perfect breeding grounds for every illness imaginable. Medieval army camps were basically disease factories with questionable hygiene standards and terrible customer reviews. Besieging armies endured the same hardships as castle occupants during extended sieges. Soldiers spent months camping in harsh conditions, dealing with terrible weather, inadequate food, and identical diseases affecting everyone else. Many siege armies lost more men to sickness than enemy action, which probably wasn't mentioned in their recruitment brochures. Boredom became a serious military challenge during long sieges. Soldiers required entertainment during months of inactivity, leading to gambling, excessive drinking, and troublemaking that commanders struggled to control. Keeping an army motivated during a 6-month camping trip with hostile neighbors was harder than planning the actual siege. When actual fighting occurred, it typically happened in brief, intense episodes rather than prolonged battles. These skirmishes usually lasted a few hours before everyone retreated to safer positions. Mental warfare often proved more important than physical combat during sieges. Both sides attempted to demoralize opponents through threats, mockery, and intimidating displays. Internal disagreements frequently determined siege outcomes. Castle defenders regularly argued among themselves about surrender timing, resistance strategies, or escape possibilities. Diplomatic negotiations concluded many sieges rather than military conquest. Peaceful solutions often benefited everyone more than continued camping and disease exposure. Supply line management mattered more than tactical brilliance in determining winners. The side maintaining consistent deliveries of food, weapons, and healthy reinforcements usually prevailed, regardless of fighting skills. When the waiting game proved too slow for medieval armies, they turned to methods that were far more creative than simply battering down the front door. Hollywood shows armies enthusiastically smashing castle walls with siege engines until convenient holes appear for heroic charges. Real medieval commanders weren't obsessed with playing architectural demolition games against fortress fortifications. Destroying thick stone walls was expensive, time-consuming, and frequently unnecessary. Medieval builders designed castle walls specifically to resist these attacks, making them incredibly thick and reinforced with earth or stone fill. Attempting to demolish proper fortress walls was like trying to erase mountains using pencil erasers. Theoretically possible, but completely impractical. Undermining represented the preferred alternative to wall destruction. This involved digging tunnels beneath castle foundations, then collapsing them to bring down wall sections or emerging inside for surprise attacks. Underground specialists were often more valuable than surface warriors because they could literally pull the rug out from under enemy feet. Successful undermining required workers who understood soil composition, structural engineering, and excavation safety. Teams dug concealed passages, reinforced them with wooden supports, and worked quietly to avoid detection by people walking overhead. Medieval miners were basically very patient moles with construction skills. The process of sapping could take weeks or months of careful excavation. Miners had to work in shifts, removing dirt quietly and disposing of it without alerting defenders. They reinforced tunnel walls with wooden posts as they went deeper. When the tunnel reached the castle foundation, they packed it with combustible materials and set it ablaze. The burning supports would collapse, bringing down sections of wall above. Water proved more effective than most siege engines as an offensive weapon. Many armies simply redirected rivers or streams that supplied castle water sources. People survived weeks without food, but died within days without water. No dramatic wall breaking required, just some clever plumbing that turned castles into very expensive deserts. Blockades were probably the most common siege tactic because they worked reliably and cost virtually nothing. Surrounding castles and preventing supply deliveries was like forcing defenders onto extremely strict diets that ended with surrender. Patience was cheaper than catapults and usually more effective too. Some armies built elaborate earthworks and wooden barriers around castles to ensure complete isolation. These siege lines could stretch for miles, completely cutting off all access to the fortress. Guards patrolled constantly to prevent supplies from reaching defenders or messages from getting out. Financial inducements deserve recognition as highly successful siege tactics rarely shown in movies. Locating someone inside who valued money more than loyalty was often easier than constructing expensive siege machinery. Internal treachery concluded more sieges than all the siege engines in medieval Europe combined. Guards accepted payment, servants responded to threats, and even nobles occasionally changed sides when situations appeared hopeless. The art of bribery required careful intelligence gathering. Attackers needed to identify which castle inhabitants might be persuaded to betray their lords. Kitchen staff could poison food stores, guards could leave gates unlocked, and servants could provide information about defensive weaknesses. A well-placed bribe often cost less than a single siege engine. Escalade attacks using ladders and ropes to scale walls quickly were another alternative to wall destruction. These surprise assaults usually happened at night or during bad weather when visibility was poor. Success depended on speed, coordination, and catching defenders off guard. Many castles surrendered without sustaining any structural damage because defenders recognized they couldn't win. When facing larger forces with superior supplies and no prospect of relief, surrender appeared intelligent rather than cowardly. Living to fight another day beat dying heroically but uselessly, especially when the alternative was slow starvation. Economic considerations influenced siege strategies more than military factors. The side affording to maintain forces longer usually prevailed. Operating sieges resembled running expensive businesses where success depended more on financial management than combat effectiveness. Political factors significantly affected siege approaches. Completely destroying castles meant rebuilding them later to control territories effectively. Capturing intact fortifications was often more valuable than creating impressive piles of expensive rubble. Smart commanders wanted to inherit functional fortresses, not expensive reconstruction projects. Seasonal timing played crucial roles in siege planning. Winter brought snow, ice, and limited daylight that complicated operations. Summer offered improved weather but increased disease risks and water shortage concerns. Many sieges were deliberately timed to take advantage of harvest seasons when castle food stores were either full or depleted. Once medieval armies did manage to get inside, the reality of what happened next was nothing like the bloodbaths that Hollywood loves to portray. Movie sieges always conclude with attackers breaking through and embarking on killing sprees that last until the credits roll. According to Hollywood, medieval armies operated like light switches, either politely camping outside or frantically murdering everyone inside. Historical reality was far more complicated and surprisingly restrained. Mass killings made terrible economic sense for medieval conquerors. Eliminating everyone in captured towns was like demolishing factories immediately after purchasing them, financially stupid and strategically counterproductive. Dead populations generated no revenue, produced no goods, and made terrible conversation partners. Medieval rulers understood practical economics better than movie scriptwriters suggest. Conquered populations represented valuable human resources to be managed rather than problems to be eliminated. Farmers still needed to cultivate crops, craftsmen still needed to manufacture goods, and merchants still needed to facilitate trade. Basically, the economy needed to keep running even after changing management. Wealthy captives were worth significantly more alive than dead because they could be ransomed. Capturing affluent nobles was like discovering treasure chests. They represented substantial potential income if handled properly. Smart attackers focused on identifying valuable prisoners rather than random violence. Historical records from major sieges demonstrate that most populations typically survived conquest. Cities that changed control multiple times during medieval conflicts retained approximately 80 to 90% of their inhabitants through each transition. People were apparently too useful to waste on dramatic gestures that looked good in stories but made no economic sense. Disease considerations actually prevented many potential massacres. Large numbers of unburied corpses created ideal conditions for plague and other illnesses that killed conquerors as readily as anyone else. Medieval people understood that creating giant outdoor morgues was bad for everyone's health, including their own. The practical challenges of executing large civilian populations were enormous for medieval armies. Forces were relatively small, and systematically eliminating populations required time, organization, and resources that commanders preferred using for other purposes. It was actually easier to let people live than organize their deaths, which probably says something about medieval efficiency standards. Conquerors required cooperative populations to maintain control over newly acquired territories. Terrorizing everyone encouraged rebellion rather than preventing it. People expecting death anyway had nothing to lose by resisting, while those expecting reasonable treatment were more likely to accept new rulers peacefully. Religious teachings limited violence during many medieval sieges. Christianity instructed that killing non-combatants was sinful, and army chaplains took these moral guidelines seriously. Medieval chronicles and stories frequently exaggerated siege violence for entertainment value. Writers discovered that tales of terrible destruction and heroic battles attracted more readers than accurate reports of successful negotiations. Economic calculations affected every aspect of post-siege behavior. Destroyed workshops, burned fields, and scattered populations required years to rebuild and made conquered territories less profitable. Speaking of practical considerations, Medieval castle builders were far more focused on keeping people in than helping them escape through elaborate underground networks. Every medieval movie includes heroes escaping through secret passages that lead from castle depths to convenient woodland locations. These tunnels are always perfectly maintained, mysteriously well lit, and spacious enough for armored knights to sprint through without hitting their heads on anything. Real castle construction followed different priorities entirely. Building underground passages was incredibly expensive and technically demanding during medieval times. Excavating through solid rock using hand tools was about as enjoyable as trying to eat soup with a fork. Technically possible, but extremely frustrating. Most castles were built on rocky, elevated terrain that made attacks difficult, but also made tunneling about as practical as digging through concrete with spoons. The specialized knowledge required for stable underground construction was rare and valuable. Master builders who understood tunnel engineering could charge premium prices and typically had more profitable projects than digging secret passages. These experts were too important to waste on projects that might never serve any purpose beyond impressing future tourists. Soil conditions determined whether tunnel construction was even feasible. Sandy ground collapsed easily, clay became waterlogged and unstable, while solid rock required specialized tools and techniques most builders lacked completely. Finding suitable ground and skilled workers was like trying to locate unicorns that could also do mathematics and work for reasonable wages. Water tables created enormous challenges for underground construction projects. Medieval drainage technology was primitive, and flooded tunnels were completely useless for escaping anything except staying dry. Many attempted tunnel projects became expensive underground swimming pools that served no defensive purpose and probably attracted unwanted wildlife. The volume of dirt produced by tunnel excavation was massive and difficult to conceal. Where exactly do you hide several tons of soil and rock when attempting to keep construction projects secret? Medieval castles weren't known for having large gardens where excess earth could be discreetly distributed without raising questions. Most supposed escape tunnels visible in modern castle ruins were actually drainage systems, storage facilities, or much later additions built centuries after original construction. Medieval tourist guides aren't always historically accurate. Sometimes sewers are just sewers, not secret passages to freedom. When genuine escape routes existed, they were usually small gates rather than elaborate tunnel networks. These concealed doors were built into walls at ground level and provided access to nearby forests or rivers, but enemies weren't foolish. They knew to search for obvious escape routes and stationed guards accordingly. The few authentic escape tunnels that did exist were typically short, crude, and extremely uncomfortable. Think crawling through muddy drainage pipes in complete darkness rather than strolling through medieval subway systems. Underground construction required constant maintenance to remain functional. Tunnels needed regular repairs to prevent collapses, drainage systems to prevent flooding, and ventilation to prevent suffocation. Security concerns made escape tunnels problematic for castle defense. Passages designed to let people out could also allow enemies to enter. Many designers avoided building escape routes because they created more defensive vulnerabilities than they solved. All of these practical realities lead to one final misconception about who actually emerged victorious from these drawn-out conflicts. Hollywood follows a predictable formula for medieval films. Identify the heroes, watch them struggle against impossible odds, then celebrate when they inevitably triumph over the villains. Movie sieges always conclude with morally superior characters winning because audiences expect justice to prevail. Real medieval sieges were determined by much more practical considerations than ethical superiority. In actual medieval warfare, victory typically went to whoever could afford maintaining armies longer. Success depended on superior logistics, greater wealth, and better patience rather than righteous causes or noble intentions. Medieval warfare was an expensive enterprise where financial resources mattered more than moral character. Basically, the richest guy usually won. Supply line management determined siege outcomes more frequently than battle tactics or individual heroism. The force maintaining consistent deliveries of food, weapons, and healthy reinforcements held enormous advantages over opponents struggling with shortages and equipment problems. Effective quartermasters were more valuable than heroic warriors, though they probably got less recognition and fewer songs written about them. Disease affected both sides equally and frequently decided siege results regardless of military strategy. Illness killed heroes and villains with identical enthusiasm. Many sieges concluded when one side or both became too sick to continue fighting effectively, making medieval warfare essentially a competition to see who could avoid dysentery the longest. Medieval peasants and common soldiers often had no understanding of why they were fighting or who qualified as enemies. Most conflicts involved complicated political disputes between nobles that ordinary people neither comprehended nor cared about. Asking medieval foot soldiers to explain their war's ethical dimensions was like asking modern fast food workers to explain corporate merger strategies. Switching allegiances during conflicts was common and usually based on survival considerations rather than ideological convictions. Towns and castles frequently changed sides when it became obvious their current allies were losing. Self-preservation trumped loyalty when choices involved changing teams or facing starvation. Medieval people were practical about their career moves. Many sieges concluded through diplomatic negotiations, protecting both attackers and defenders. These peaceful solutions often benefited everyone more than fighting until complete victory or defeat. Medieval politics were complicated, and current enemies might become essential future business partners, so burning bridges was generally bad policy. The concept of heroes and villains in medieval conflicts was largely invented by later storytellers and historians. Real political disputes involved competing territorial claims, inheritance arguments, and economic disagreements that rarely had obvious moral dimensions. Most medieval wars concerned money and power rather than good versus evil. Weather and seasonal changes influenced siege outcomes more than heroic determination or villainous plotting. Armies launching sieges during inappropriate seasons often retreated due to snow, rain, or extreme temperatures rather than enemy resistance. Natural forces were completely impartial and could defeat any army regardless of moral standing. Fortifications and terrain advantages usually mattered more than the righteousness of either side's cause. Well-designed castles and strong positions could resist sieges by much larger forces, while poorly defended locations fell quickly regardless of their occupants' virtue. The reality of medieval siege warfare was that most conflicts concluded through compromise, exhaustion, or practical necessity rather than triumph of good over evil. Victory usually went to whoever made fewer mistakes and managed resources more effectively.